Hi, good afternoon everyone. Masih semangat kan ya? Who is hungry? Tired? Who have joined the events since the opening ceremony? Wow, great, awesome. So welcome to the FPCI's Conference on Indonesian Foreign Policy 2023. My name is Lucia, currently working at the Cabinet Secretariat of the Republic of Indonesia. And I'm also a proud FPCI Women in Foreign Fellow. So I will be your moderator in this session on a world of risks and opportunities, a discussion on the world's evolving geopolitical and geoeconomic landscape. I heard there are more than 500 people joining this session, so it is an honor for me, and I will be hosting this session until 4:40. So before I invite our distinguished panelists, may I ask quick questions to the audience? It's not a quiz, so there is no right or wrong answer. Just hands up question. So the first one, who believe that we are living an era of plenty opportunities for humanity? Quite pessimistic. Okay, the next one. Who still believe that the great power countries are still having great power? Okay, wonderful. Last questions. Who believe that the middle power countries have important roles in reshaping geopolitics and geoeconomic? Quite optimistic, half of the room. So, to enlighten us on this topic, let me welcome our distinguished panelists. The first one, Professor Rory Metcalfe, the head of National Security College, Australian National University. Please give a warm welcome to Professor Rory. You are on the second one. The second one, I would like to welcome Professor Shinoda Kunihiko, the Executive Advisor of the National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies Alliance. Next, I would like to welcome Professor Joseph Liu, Dean of College of Humanities, Arts, and Social Sciences, and Tan Kah-hee, Chair Professor in Comparative and International Politics, Nanyang Technological University. And our last speaker, I would like to welcome Pak Michael Vatikiotis, Senior Advisor of the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue. Please give warm welcome to Pak Michael. Okay, so good afternoon for all of our speakers. It is very nice to have all of you here today joining us in this session. So as we know that topic of this discussion is of timely nature and critical importance, because with the rising geopolitical tension, as the two little wars are raging, the Russia-Ukraine war in East Europe and the Israel-Hamas war in Gaza and in Middle East, and then besides the rising geopolitical tension, we also see the world is facing the risk of policy-driven geoeconomic fragmentation. So for all the speakers, I have a first question. You may have 5 minutes to answer this question. So my question is, what concerns you the most in this current geopolitical and geoeconomic landscape? How should countries size opportunities and adversaries, and what sort of mentality that foreign policymakers should have? Let us start with Professor Rory. You may have 5 minutes.
Thank you for that difficult question. And it's a pleasure to be here. So before I begin, I also want to say how admiring I am of the dynamism, the energy, the ideas that I've already seen in the conference today. And I think it sets a very high bar for the rest of us. So congratulations to FPCI and what it's doing. But on the difficult issue, look, there's no question in my mind that there is a world of deeply interconnected and cascading risk that we're facing now. There's always been a degree of risk and uncertainty in international affairs, and we have to think back through history, study the history of our countries, the history of the world, it is not new to be in a world of risk that crosses borders, affects the interests of our countries. There is something different, though, about this age, in my view, and I think the challenge also poses an opportunity, particularly for your generation, and that's the impact of connectivity on risk in the world. So we've all been through the COVID-19 pandemic. In recent years, for example, we've all seen the cascading and rippling effects of geostrategic crises and conflicts, the economic consequences of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the war in Ukraine, for example. We all know that supply chains are vulnerable. We all know that ideologies of division cross borders as well, and we all know that disinformation now travels around the world instantaneously. So it is an era where the challenges of connectivity turn into a kind of geostrategic contagion. It makes it really difficult for governments to set priorities to protect their interests and their values and their national identities going forward. It's not impossible, and I think the tests that our countries now face, and we heard a little bit of this morning actually with talk of grand strategy. So I think the remarks by, for example, the presidential candidate, Ms. Osborne, on this broad, the idea of grand strategy, the idea that these days countries cannot afford to deal with problems in isolation. They cannot afford to just use one instrument of national power. Not everything has a military solution. Not everything has a purely diplomatic solution either, truth be told. So I think the test now is with a joined up approach, and I'm just going to conclude his opening remarks with, I guess, what I see as 5 principles of policy. I know this is the country of Punjab, so five is a good number. 5 principles, which I actually call 5 principles of competitive coexistence, because there is strategic competition in the world. The first step is to build coexistence before we can build anything like trust and cooperation. And so, in no particular order, the 5 points I want to come back to throughout the conversation. One is diplomacy, but another is deterrence. I think there is a role to use deterrence, to use military power to say to countries, don't do stupid things, don't take risks. There's a fundamental role for development. It's the third of those pillars, and probably that is the most important of the pillars, because unless populations have their needs met, unless populations see greater opportunity in the future than in the past, of course they're not going to be satisfied. And the final two pillars are resilience, national resilience, ensuring that you have a strong society at home before you engage internationally. And the final word I'll use is solidarity, because I feel with solidarity, no country can do this alone. So maybe later on we'll talk about coalitions of people powers as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Rory. Next is Professor Sudha. The same question. You may have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Lucia. And it's truly an honor for me to speak before such a talented group of young students. At GRIPS, where I work in Japan, we have collaborated with FPCI to organize numerous international webinars. Additionally, we have set up a GRIPS booth in front of this conference room. So if anyone is interested in studying Japan, please feel free to visit us later. And now turning to the questions I've received. The most pressing concerns currently include geopolitical shifts, such as a strategic competition between the United States and China, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and the Israel-Hamas conflict. And firstly, these developments are widening the confrontation between Western countries and China and Russia, leading to a competition for influence over emerging and developing nations, collectively referred to as the global south. Secondly, with crises like the Ukrainian war and Israel-Hamas conflict, along with potential crises in Asia, such as North Korea or the Taiwan Strait, the United States could face a three-front conflict, making it challenging to manage without burden sharing among its allies and partner nations. Thirdly, issues like Russian invasion of Ukraine contribute to chain reactions such as energy and food supply chain instability, rising prices, delayed action on climate change, and widening economic disparities in developing countries. And addressing these challenges is undoubtedly difficult, but facing adversity and seizing new opportunity are essential to stabilizing the international order. And Japan, as demonstrated in the G7 Hiroshima Summit held this year, has presented collaborative efforts not only within the G7, but also in coordination with Global South countries. Firstly, it's crucial to establish a rules-based international order. Middle powers should advocate for respecting principles outlined in the UN Charter, such as sovereignty and territory integrity, supporting just and lasting peace, and discouraging attempts to unilaterally change the status quo through force. And secondly, advanced and global South nations should enhance cooperation to address various social chain challenges. This involves leveraging advanced energy, digital, and bio-related technologies to promote green growth, expand energy and food supplies, and increase coverage of universal health care. And now, what mentally should foreign policy makers of the world related to geopolitical shifts and various risks is crucial. And secondly, engaging in dialogue with countries holding different perspectives to deepen mutual understanding for collaborative problem solving is essential. And lastly, demonstrating a commitment for middle powers to take the lead in stabilizing the international order and achieving international cooperation, not solely relying on the major powers.
Professor Shinoda, sorry, can you talk louder?
Yeah.
I mean, like closer to the mic.
To the young students participating today, I strongly hope that you will play a significant role in the future, whether in the Indonesian government, international organization, or any involving the formulation and implementation of foreign policies. Thank you.
Next is Professor Joseph. The same question. You may have 5 minutes.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very glad to and honored to be able to be here with you and on this panel with my distinguished colleagues. One thing that keeps me up at night when thinking about geopolitical, geoeconomic trends, among many other things, is populism, right? Which we can see unfolding before our eyes, causing fragmentation of global order, global society, and creating pressures for governments. We know that Henry Kissinger passed away a few days ago. In a sense, it's symbolic of the sort of passing of one generation, a generation where people thought in terms of grand strategy and acted, or at least tried to act in terms of grand strategy. I think for many governments, including yours in Indonesia, mine in Singapore, Australia, you're from all over the place. But for many governments, this is a big challenge. Yeah. We see this in the United States in a very sort of acute way, right? Not just with Donald Trump a few years ago. What he really did was just catalyze things that were already boiling in American society. I would say to some extent we see this in China as well, although populism in a different form, yeah, and against the backdrop of a different kind of politics. We see this in if you think about the most pressing, most recent crises, whether it's Russia, Ukraine, Palestine, yeah, I think I'll end with that example. Palestine, Arab states I do not believe that the Arab states want to go down the road of sort of breaking off rapprochement efforts with Israel. Yeah, but and they're not big fans of Hamas, as we all know. But on the other hand, the mood on the ground is creating pressures that are of concern to them. Yeah? And the mood on the ground, by the way, is creating pressures everywhere, including in Indonesia, including in Singapore, including in Australia, pressuring governments to take a certain position. Now, I'm not passing judgment on the Palestine issue and saying what is right, what is wrong. All I'm trying to point out is that we live, foreign policy makers and strategists in government live in a world today where it's not simply a case of them trying to sort of frame the issue and then see what the best options are. Even as they do that, they have no choice. They have to consider the domestic audience and the kind of response that they get from that. So what can we do about this? I'll just point out one thing. An event like this and an organization like the Foreign Policy Community of Indonesia is quite critical. Why? Because it provides people with an opportunity to engage in discussions, informed discussions about foreign policy, about the world and the challenges that the world faces. And very soon, they will, you will not only vote, you will even eventually be in positions where you have to make these decisions. Yeah. So an opportunity to be exposed to the challenges and the opportunities that the evolving geopolitics and geoeconomics offers for your country and for our Southeast Asia region, I think is quite critical. So yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Last one, Pak Michael.
Thank you. Thank you, and it's great to be here for the second time. I want to follow on from Joe's point about populism and what its implications are for us in the world today. I think the major risk we face in the world today is the inability of concerted international action to prevent war. We live in an age, I think, where war is inevitably happening because the current international system is unable to prevent it. And related to that is the fact that they no longer apply any rules to warfare. The way that war is waged is no longer governed by a set of rules. 14,000 people have died in Gaza under heavy bombardment. 68% of them are children, women and children. My former boss, who's now the head of the United Nations humanitarian wing called OCHA, has said that this is a crisis of humanity. It's not just the crisis of the Middle East, it's a crisis for everyone, because war has become the option of the day. In Europe, we're closer to a nuclear war than we ever were for my generation during the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States, because Russia and Ukraine, again, not abiding by any rules. There are basically no rules anymore. They simply don't apply. And one reason for the failure of the international system is, as Joe was implying earlier, this polarization of everything. Global views on almost any issue are polarized. It might have been possible, for instance, to bring an end to the Ukraine war early on in that war if the Europeans hadn't been so vehemently in favor of a principle of sovereignty and non-interference that they themselves have violated repeatedly. Similarly, the war in Gaza that threatens to go regional could have been easily stopped in its earlier stages. But the major Western powers were adamant about protecting Israel's right to defense. Right to defense, right to kill women and children. So many countries may feel that they've taken the right moral stand or legal stand, but as a result, a whole range of international norms and laws aimed at limiting the spread and effects of warfare have been completely devalued. Thank you.
So following up to your answer, Pa Michael, you mentioned about we used to live in the age where the international system are unable to prevent war. So when we look at the wars in Gaza and Ukraine and how the international community is responding to this, do you think we are seeing an increasingly divided world? And how we can reassure the anxieties of people upon the intent of rising tensions? Please, Pa Michael, the floor is yours.
So, of course, with every major crisis, there are always opportunities. And I think the opportunity that is before us is to completely reframe and rewrite the rules of the international order. The question is, how do we do that? One of the problems in the West is that they have lost the primacy that they used to have, effectively. Whether you ascribe that to the rise of larger powers like China, or simply the fact that actually the old norms and values that governed the international order have simply, as I said earlier, been devalued. And so I think there is a demand now to write a new set of rules or to reframe the rules, refurbish them, and this has to be done in a more inclusive way. And my very simple prescription for this is that intellectuals the world over need to sit down and think about what those rules would look like. And I think Indonesia can play a significant role in this by essentially taking advantage of the 70th anniversary of the Bandung Conference that was mentioned earlier by Anies Baswedan, and emulating that sort of exercise for parts of the world to come together and try to think about how the world should be governed in a more inclusive way.
Okay, thank you, Pa Michael. So related to this, I have another question to Professor Rory, because I asked before to the audience how they see the role of middle powers, and during the humanitarian conflict in Gaza, we see how the foreign minister of OIC, including Indonesia foreign minister, do the tours, try to solve the crisis and the conflict. So my question to you, how do you see middle powers shape the current international order? Are the middle powers moving in the right path? Please, Professor Rory, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, and that's a very wide-ranging question. I think it is good to know that there's a strong level of confidence in the room that the middle powers can do more. And it doesn't really matter what we call them, and I often use the word middle players rather than middle powers, because the actual scale of power that a middle power has can vary wildly. It's an interesting question, how do we define Japan in the space? How do we define Australia or South Korea, various European powers, or indeed Indonesia? We're all actually very different in our scale. But what is similar about all of those countries is that they're not China, they're not the United States. None of them has the capacity to achieve outcomes in the world through force alone. They need rules and they need coalitions. And I think that the opportunity for middle powers, whether it's in the kind of world to describe or whether it's in the midst of a different set of risks, because not all of the risks the world faces are about war, they're also risks, or more than risks, actually certainties about the harm that climate change can cause, for example. They're all going to need collective responses. What's changed, I think, in recent years is a recognition, if people like to revive memory, that powers have agency, as, for example, the Australian Foreign Minister likes to say. That is, that they're not simply going to be broken away individually by the major powers, either coerced individually or co-opted individually. They can work together, not only to encourage certain rules and norms, but also collectively the powers actually do have a degree of influence and strength. Just to be, I guess, a little bit provocative about this, this is not purely about the moral persuasion that middle powers have. This is a world where each country does need to, as I said before, in resilience at home, look to its own defences, its own capacity. But I think we can be much more creative now in building coalition, and looking at Indo-Pacific, for example, where I guess a lot of nations and middle powers, groups that are not only ASEAN countries or not only US allies, but cross-cutting groups. For example, Australia and Indonesia can work together as a kind of core to build bridges between those two communities. These are the groups that can then work with the larger institutions, in this case the ASEAN-centric institutions, to establish those rules or redefine those rules. I think that's one point where I agree with Michael. And the rules in this case here in the Indo-Pacific can be, for example, how do countries treat one another in the maritime domain, where resources are under pressure, where boundaries are contested, where China in particular uses pretty heavy coercive pressure against smaller countries. There are ways that we can build a kind of collective response and move powers in a lead way.
Thank you, Professor Rory. So we agree with the importance of cooperation and collaboration between the middle power countries. But Professor Joseph, you mentioned before about fragmentation, including among the governments. After several decades of increasing global cooperation to multilateral platform, there has been debates on whether unilateralism is more effective form of cooperation today. We have seen the emergence of groupings such as AUKUS, Quad, BRICS. So how do you see this trend? What does it mean for multilateralism today?
Thanks for that question. And actually, it leads on quite nicely from Rory's response, right? Because this issue of middle power or middle player activism and leadership, minilaterals, in a sense, provides one platform for them to sort of engage the world and change things, as it were. But to take a couple of steps back to the sort of crisis that multilateralism is facing, and this also flows very much from what Michael mentioned earlier on the need to change the rules, right? Because we know multilateralism, at least as it came out of the Second World War, first with the UN, and then the Bretton Woods and the range of institutions that flowed from that, and then over time other sort of big multilateral institutions. There was a period alongside globalization where humanity held out much hope for multilateralism until we found out that it was easily hijacked by the great powers, and great powers obstructed a lot of the potential of multilateral efforts. The best example being the UN Security Council, right? And it was out of that, number one. And number two, I would say already early on a latent discomfort with how the rules were bent in one direction, but the rest of the world, as it were, was not powerful, was not influential enough to sort of push for change, right? But that has changed over time, right? With the rise of China, India, Japan, etc. And so now we have a situation where smaller states, middle powers or middle players, middle-sized states are trying to seize the initiative on functional areas. Right, we're not going to save the world, but if we can pardon my use of this phrase, yeah, but a coalition of the willing, yeah, there's a lot of baggage to that term, but you know what I mean, right? A group of countries that are prepared to work together to advance their shared interest on a particular issue. Going ahead to do that in a sort of a minilateral format. So some have been more successful than others. The big one now, of course, everyone talks about is BRICS. Personally, I think BRICS is basically just China and everyone else. And I don't think it will go as far as what people hope or think that it will. But it's an effort along precisely these lines, right? And an effort born of concern that the United States holds too much financial power in the world and is at liberty to use that power to compel states to do things they would not otherwise do. Yeah? So very valid concerns. But of course, concern is one thing. Whether you can fix the problem without creating another problem, that's another issue. Yeah. But in general, I think you're right to suggest that we are seeing this trend towards more minilateralism.
Thank you, Professor Joseph. So, Professor Sinoda, still related to what Professor Joseph explained, in an effort to mitigate the risk posed by geoeconomic fragmentation and also the geopolitical uncertainties, there has been an increasing need for diversification of the global supply chain and investment. So, how would you define the fine line between diversifying and decoupling? Thank you. Please, you have the floor.
Thanks for the questions. And the strategic competition between the United States and China has expanded from trade friction, such as the implementation of additional tariffs, to technological hegemony competition involving export and investment controls. Within this context, issues like partial disruption in the global supply chain between the United States and China have arisen. Now let's explore the differences between decoupling and the diversification of the supply chain. Decoupling involves strict management of sensitive technologies such as AI and advanced semiconductors, which are crucial to national security through measures like export and investment controls. And however, as the US National Security Advisor Sullivan stated, the United States aims to protect fundamental technologies within a small yard and high fence, limiting the scope primarily for national security reasons without completely severing trade ties with China. In fact, trade between the United States and China increased last year compared to the previous year. On the other hand, regarding the diversification of the supply chain, it's essential not to depend on specific countries for resources like legacy semiconductors, critical minerals required for battery production, or active pharmaceutical ingredients. To mitigate risks, like-minded nations should invest in and diversify resilient supply chains. This is known as supply chain diversification or de-risking. And what significance do these policies hold for middle parts like Indonesia? Firstly, under the concept of a small yard and high fence, if decoupling is rigorously managed, there's a potential for continued economic growth through the expansion of trade and investment under frameworks like the WTO and FTAs. And secondly, even in the face of natural disasters, pandemics, or economic conflicts, companies operating in Indonesia can secure sources for parts and materials, ensuring sustainable production. And thirdly, as the US and like-minded countries promote the diversification of the supply chain, increased foreign investment can be expected in expanding production bases for legacy semiconductors and the development of mineral resources for battery production. Already, Japan and Indonesia have been steadily advancing trade and investment liberalization and rulemaking through bilateral FTA, ASEAN-Japan Comprehensive Economic Partnership, and RCEP, and other initiatives. Furthermore, initiatives like the Japan-ASEAN Economic Resilience Action Plan and the IPEF supply chain agreement aim to cooperate in advancing the diversification and visualization of supply chain. And expanding such cooperation in the Indo-Pacific region is believed to contribute to the regional stability and prosperity through increased trade and investment and the seamless flow of goods in times of emergency. Thank you.
Does somebody want to add something?
I'd like to add to Joe's point about multilaterals, if you don't mind, and a little bit Rory's point. I think actually in order to have a proper exercise of framing new rules, we cannot leave it to states. And the problem with the multilaterals is there's still the state structures. So we need to fashion a new platform. And I would argue strongly that conferences like this, for instance, it has to be a bottom-up process to begin with. Yes, it's cumbersome, it's going to take time, it has to be carefully facilitated, orchestrated, and managed. But actually, if you ask the people that are the objects of the problems in the world today, and the lack of rules and the inability of those rules to govern moral behavior in a proper way, I think actually it's worth going to the people to ask them first. And a more efficient way of doing this, rather than using state structures, is to create different dialogue platforms led by thinkers, civil society, people who are not governed by the interests of states. Because it's actually the interests of states that are causing us a lot of problems. Climate change is a classic example. I mean, it's obvious that 1% of the world's population controls the ability to limit carbon emissions and is not doing so. There's an argument for a more insurgent approach to climate change, managing climate change, which gives people the right to have, to say to the people that govern them that you can no longer do this. So you have to have a set of rules that give people more of a say, more of, if you like, a global democracy. And so I would lastly say that I think it's important to no longer use the word norms, because norms implies whose norms. I would far rather use an ethical framing. And one way to start this process is to actually examine the sort of code of ethics that the world should be governed by. It's a more universal framing. And it has to start with people, with thinkers, and then, once a set of ideas is framed, then the states can consider it, either in a multilateral setting or the multilateral setting of the United Nations.
Thank you, Pak. Quoted from what you said, to create different dialogue platform. This is what actually we are doing right now.
It's what you're doing
We should
here.
encourage more dialogue platform. Okay.
I think it would be great to have more, if you like, constant and sophisticated civil society dialogue in this region and internationally. It is difficult to do that in circumstances where political systems are so different around the world. And I think one of the very inspiring thoughts I heard this morning was the focus on, for example, the quality of Indonesian democracy, the fact that you can have an open conversation like this. There are some countries in the region internationally where that isn't the case. And so, I mean, it's a great aspiration, but I think reaching civil society in a genuine and spontaneous way in some countries in the region is going to be harder than others. So we
Fair enough.
Yeah, can I jump in as well? Yeah, you've triggered.
Because I have to be strict.
Yeah, so this is what makes it fun, right? I'm sympathetic to what Michael has identified, but I think another problem is enforcement, right? Getting the rules or changing and revising the rules is one thing, but as we know, a lot of the problems with the world today, so to speak, is not the absence of rules, but the absence of enforcement. Right, whether it's political will or institutions. And if you think about enforcement, either A, you fall back on states, in some way, shape or form. If not, who's going to enforce it? Civil society? I think then for me at least, it circles back to my nightmare scenario of populism, right? So yeah, I think it's important, the engagement, the ideas, and the spirit of having it from the ground up, I think is important. But probably it's working together with the state rather than identifying the state as the problem. If only because we need to think through how to enforce and how to sort of penalize. I mean, you mentioned climate change. One of the big problems is the state is a problem, but so are private commercial interests. Yeah. So who's going to regulate them? That's another challenge.
Okay, great. Thanks to all of the speakers for the fruitful and enlightening discussion. So let us now begin with the Q&A session. Wow, very enthusiastic. But let me remind you first, please keep your questions or comments brief and concise, so as to allow other participants to ask the speakers as well. When taking the floor, please state your name and affiliation and to whom your question want to be addressed. So due to the limited time, I will open the Q&A session for the 2 questions. Maybe the male with the blue shirt, because you raise your hand first. And another one is the girl in the front. Yeah. With the gray shirt, later even.
Good afternoon. Name is Ivan Combs, Asian graduate from the UK, but just did a couple of internship in sustainable policies. But I'd like to ask something that is quite personal, because governments around the world are talking about artificial intelligence, AI, and the geopolitics, geoeconomic rivalries about that. Do you think that there will be any government framework from Indonesia about tackling the impacts of AI towards society? And the second question, my question about AI will be enough, or do you mind if I ask another questions?
Just one question, because we need another people to ask.
Okay, thank you.
Do you have a specific speaker who wants to answer your question?
I can answer the question right away because I have a.
Perfect.
It's a very good question. You know, the world's processors, the things that run servers, for instance, internet servers, they run on open source software, usually Linux. Not Microsoft, not Apple, it's open source. The question is, do we want to, if we move into the AI realm, do we want that to be completely open source? And there is an argument that in case of software, which is limited by how it's used, that's not a problem. But in the case of AI, if everything was just open source, it's a recipe for anarchy, it's a recipe for someone getting control of that AI and being able to do larger things. So there is an argument, to answer your question, that each country or each region should actually have sovereign limits on AI so that they can tailor it to their own systems, their own regions, their own societies.
Do you have follow-up questions? Is that okay? Okay.
What would be open for governments to, for example, Indonesia, if they want to take the opportunity for AI?
Yeah, so they would have to define boundaries for AI in an Indonesian context, is one argument.
Somebody wants to answer? No, okay. Please state your name and affiliation.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. Hi, my name is Dana. I'm 16 years old and I'm a student at ACS Jakarta. So this question is directed to Professor Joseph. As he previously stated, it is the interest of states that are currently causing us global issues. So my question is, do you think that involving citizens in dialogue pose more drawbacks or benefits for current geopolitical issues? Thank you so much.
Thanks for that question. I think it is important, in fact, it is imperative for states now to engage their citizens and to get feedback on issues. Yeah. So when I shared my concerns about populism, I didn't mean that that there shouldn't be any engagement. You know, that is another recipe for disaster, right? There has to be engagement, but the question is, do you want to end up in a situation where the tail wags the dog? Yeah, where, you know, a government makes a decision because it's popular on the ground, regardless of whether it makes sense in the long term for the very people that they want to sort of enact that policy for. And I think, frankly, if you ask me, the best and most profound example of this is the United States withdrawal from the regional trade agreement. It doesn't make sense economically. It doesn't make sense strategically. In fact, if the United States was in the TPP today and decided that it wanted to sort of accelerate its competition with China, it would be in a much better position to do that than it currently is. So even if you think in those terms, right? Yeah, so all for engagement, but the calculations leading to the policies will have to be made by the people who are tasked every waking hour to make them. That's my view.
Yes. Since the committee give us extra time for the second Q&A session, I would like to give another 2 questions. Okay. Maybe the male with the black shirt at the back. Yeah, Mas, yeah. Yeah.
I'd like to. My name is Mohamed Al-Talib. I am with the Business School.
Can you speak louder? Sorry.
Okay. I would like to direct the questions to Professor Leo, Dr. Joseph Leo. You said that the international system project, namely the United Nations, is unable to prevent any sort of conflict or decisions made by the powerful states to exclude themselves from any decisions made by the system itself. Does that mean the UN, let's say UN is failing and we might be getting to another great war? That's the question. Thank you very much.
Sorry, the last part. Whether the UN is failing, yes, and then
And we might be heading to
another great war. Okay. I don't think although the United Nations was established in order or in the hope of preventing another sort of global war, from the Second World War, I don't think the two are sort of directly correlated, in the sense that if we consider the UN a failure, which many people do, therefore you are going to get a major conflict. I think the question. So the first part, whether the UN is a failure, I would just say that a lot of people are very, very disillusioned and disappointed with the UN. And, again, Michael's point is absolutely right. If you look at global conflicts, recent global conflicts, whether it's Russia, Ukraine, or even Gaza for that matter, the way the UN has been set up has been an impediment to international society trying to deal with that problem. Yeah. Whether or not there will be a major war, I think you are essentially looking at the US and China, because those are the two powers that have the wherewithal to fight on a global scale. But as we have seen in many, many cases, primarily World War I and World War II, what becomes a global war doesn't start with the great powers deciding to fight each other, right? It started with local conflicts, right? That for a variety of reasons went out of control. And so this ties back to the point about the failure of multilateralism, the importance of having other venues, because we need to make sure that all effort is made available to diffuse local conflicts. Yeah, and the UN doesn't help, unfortunately, in that regard.
Thank you. Professor Yuri, you want to add something?
If I was to add something on that question, it's a great question, and I think the answer is sadly only in a small part about the UN system and about international institutions. It is also in a large part about the risk calculations that leaders and governments make. And so if we do look at the examples here in the Indo-Pacific, the examples of potential flashpoints most of them involving China. So Taiwan, East China Sea, South China Sea, etc. It's quite plausible that a conflict in one of those circumstances could begin with an extreme level of risk-taking, but not with the intention to go to war, but it could escalate. It's also possible that the conflict would be quite deliberate. So I think while we need to work with the international institutions and with the regional institutions, those 5 principles I outlined at the beginning, that do include national resilience, and include solidarity, and include deterrence as well as diplomacy, those are all important. I think one of the messages I would leave
the group with today is that the middle powers and the smaller powers of the region all need to find ways of communicating, that extreme risk-taking in this region does not make sense, that, for example, threats to take aggressive action against Taiwan or threats to use military force are not in China's interests, nor are they in any of our interests, because as we've already seen in Ukraine, we've already seen in Gaza, once conflict begins, it's very difficult to control the consequences, economic, humanitarian crisis. It's too large for this region to pay for a major war. So I think there's a message there, and that message needs to be communicated by leaders, but also by civil society and the private sector.
Thank you, Professor. So for the last question in the Q&A session, I would like to give the chance to female audience. Is there any female audience who want to ask something? Female audience? No? Okay, so anyone who wants to ask the question? Okay, the guy with the black shirt.
Thank you very much. First of all, for Michael, I really love your Indonesian topics under Suharto. It's great. But my question, I think, will be answered most suitably by Professor Shinoze. Just before lunchtime, in this exact room, we were talking about with ambassador from India and also ambassadors from Indonesia and Malaysia about the rise of global south and what BRICS, if BRICS is a manifestation of the rise of the global south. And in my opinion, their answer are very, very careful. So they don't really, tell us what they really want and what they really believe in. So because this panel is all of you are academics, I would like to know, especially Professor Shinoze's response, and what is your opinion about BRICS? Is it a risk? Is BRICS a risk for the global security and global stability? Is it a form of a Thucydides trap and incoming conflict between China and America, or is it just an opportunity for global South countries to cooperate and to develop outside of the current Western framework that has dominated us for the last 20 or 30 years? That's my question.
Yeah, as is mentioned by my colleague, BRICS is a kind of forum for which was taken. China has taken the lead in that. But I think there are many possibilities among the BRICS members to advance cooperation, especially to deal with the social and economic issues which these global South countries has faced with. This includes something like climate change problem or poverty eradication, and also aging society. And also, I think G7 countries can collaborate with these global South countries to take advantage of not only BRICS, but also G20 or other forum. And I think the most important thing is to solve this kind of economic and social issues and stabilize the international order within the global South countries.
Yeah, just very quickly on the BRICS. I think the BRICS is a very interesting idea, right, on paper, okay? But you need to we need to consider a few things. First is, especially if you look at the 5 BRICS countries, they don't actually trade a lot with each other. They trade a lot with the rest of the world, but less so with each other. That's problem number 1. Problem number 2, it will primarily be anchored by China. Okay, no matter what the other countries, including the new members, say, it's primarily anchored by China. But in order for China to I won't even say usurp, to take some of the American sort of financial influence away. China has to liberalize its capital account, which China will not do. It is too risky, especially when you're looking at a government that is averse to taking risks. Economic risk today, not political risk, economic risk. So China is not going to do that. So it makes it very difficult for people to enthusiastically embrace using the yuan internationally to trade. Some will because of the uneven relationship between China and the recipient country. But I don't think it will be the magnitude of what the advocates and champions of BRICS hopes. And the last point, in BRICS, you have China and you have India. Okay, I think that explains it.
Michael, you want to jump in?
Yeah, when we talk about BRICS and other forums, and indeed the whole narrative of mid-sized middle powers, what we're essentially talking about is a bid to redistribute power or redistribute decision-making on global issues. Now, I think that's great on paper, but in practice, of course, let's say we were able to redistribute power. There's no guarantee that power would be used more responsibly. Because at the end of the day, states behave as states and they have their interests. And of course, there is a degree of tension between states in terms of competition for resources, competition for power. And so I think there's a limit to how much we can redistribute power through these different forums. What we essentially need is a better way of governing the competition for power and resources. And so I think that's why people often focus on the need to reform the UN Security Council, which of course has all the decision-making, if you like, at the multilateral level. And then secondly, there's a lot of talk about, will there ever be a time where the US dollar is no longer the single currency for international arbitration of any kind? Settlement of any kind? Will there be other currencies that balance it out? These are fundamental issues. So when we talk about the minilateral or the mid-sized power or the new alternative regional groupings, we have to remember here what we're talking about. It's about redistributing power and whether that's actually what we want or how can it be best managed.
Professor Rory, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I think my point's largely been made, which is if you're looking at the future of the distribution of power in the world, if you're looking at the relative role of BRICS, look very closely at India, because India is a power that not only combines its own, if you like, civilizational ambitions, but it has diplomacy that at one level, like Indonesia, is looking in many directions. It's trying to engage in many directions, but it's doing it, I think, with an added dimension of power politics, with its own kind of determination and sometimes ruthlessness there as well. So I think we need to be realistic about that, because the India-China relationship is not actually a happy relationship, and I don't see it becoming a happy relationship anytime soon.
Thank you, wonderful. Thank you so much, Professor Rory Metcalf, Professor Shinoda Kunihiko, Professor Joseph Leo, and Pak Michael Patikiotis. Let's give another round of applause to our speakers. And for the audience, thank you so much for your participation in this session. Thanks to FPCI for inviting me as the moderator. Don't forget to join our two last sessions, the Battle of Brains at Puri Agung Room and the session with Pak Ganjar. Thank you.